Thank you, Ken. That was wonderful. Now we're going to switch directions just again and talk about brucellosis management tools. Eric Maichak moved west after growing up and getting a couple of degrees in Oklahoma and Arkansas. He's worked for Wyoming Game and Fish for 12 years as a brucellosis feed ground habitat biologist, and he now battles brucellosis in other people cases.
Thanks, Chris. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Hey, thanks everyone for coming this morning. It's not easy to get up after Friday night of waiting. Yeah. So, as Angela and Jared both pointed out, yeah, we do have peat grounds in the western part of the state, primarily Jackson area, and at least in Wyoming. That's all we focus on most today. These started out in 1910, 1911, the National Health Refuge. Essentially, these were to prevent damage to stored hay crops as well as kind of rebuild birds that, as Juan pointed out last night, have been decimated by market. Today, or I guess over time, feed grounds became a primary tool to try to prevent the spread of brucellosis to livestock. And currently we have 21 feed grounds, including National Health Refuge, and I guess it would be 23 staging. So brucellosis, as folks probably are aware, is transmitted. Elka Boris and Chris Colligan's getting a lot of mileage out of this picture. Years ago when we were capturing elk. Animal aborts, and it's unfortunate that feed grounds tend to concentrate elk during the transmission period. So as Jared's study pointed out, yeah, most of the time period those animals are on the feed ground, abortions are occurring. Animal makes contact, and then occasionally you do have elk that get off the feed ground and get into a commingling situation, like what you see down here. And this tends to maintain the friction between wildlife and livestock interests. And really the debate, I guess, over how best to manage the disease. So in the 1920s, there was a vaccine that was developed called Strain 19. It was a live vaccine, a live version of Brucella abortus, and it was actually discovered by accident. The main point is that they found that if you inoculated bovine with this, pregnant bovine, and then challenged her with the field strain of Brucella, a really nasty bug, it prevented abortions, and quite a few of these. I'm not sure exactly how many, but it was enough that it became part of the U.S. Bovine brucellosis eradication program in the 1930s and carried on now. So in the 1970s, Tom Thorne, Dr. E. Tom Thorne with Wyoming Game and Fish, he started conducting some controlled trials with the vaccine and felt that this may be a way to mitigate the disease in elk, and found that also in these controlled trials, it also resulted in fewer abortions in elk that challenged the field strain. So lo and behold, it seemed like that maybe we found this epic, mythical cure-all to brucellosis. So all the cliches, sword and stone, silver bullet, and all that. So in 1985, Game and Fish embarked on this pretty ambitious vaccination program, and started out at Grazer Feed Ground down at Star Valley. And by 1997, it had expanded to all the feed grounds. Well, we continued to do this in 2015, and in that time, we had vaccinated, on average, across all feed grounds all years, 97% of all our elk calves. Primarily, we wanted to focus on elk calves. It looked like the vaccine was going to provide lifelong immunity. This is over 85,000 elk, huge effort. And then also, for the first 3 years of the program, on each feed ground, they would go out and vaccinate yearling and older females. And this was to help boost herd immunity. And so it felt like, based on Tom Thorne's recommendation of several other vets, that this was going to work. This was going to either control or eliminate brucellosis one way or another. So some of the cursory results, nobody had really tested it. And people were interested. It's like, well, is it actually working? Is this doing anything to mitigate brucellosis. So Heritage, he was a student that got tasked with looking at the program and found that it's effective delivery method. People were able to condition elk to vaccinate with this biocoat. It's essentially how you vaccinate a ballistic bullet. So you don't shoot them with 30-06 or 12 gauge or anything like that. It's like a little pellet from an air gun. And so the method worked, continued to expand, and some of the initial results suggested that it reduced the prevalence of the disease, prevalence of brucellosis, based on blood serum that was tested for exposure to abortions. Some of the subsequent analyses suggested otherwise and created a big debate over whether or not the disease or the management program was worthwhile and was actually working. So for us, what we wanted to do was actually test, run a real critical test on the program and see, well, did it in fact work? So two primary metrics that we use, blood and then also vaginal implant transmitters. So first with blood, we had a sample of over 5,000 serum samples that Wyoming State Vet Lab had run a battery of tests on each sample to see if the animal could be classified as seropositive, so she'd been exposed to a fetus at some point in her life, or seronegative, if not been exposed, or at least not able to provide enough results to say that she was seropositive. Then from 2006 through 2015, so the vaccine is actually intended to prevent abortion. Well, as technology develops, you're able to do some different things, and we wanted to test whether or not the vaccine actually prevented abortion. So we narrowed this down, and we deployed vaginal implants in, I don't know, probably, and recovered them in something like 550, 600 elk for over 10 years. We narrowed it down to seropositives. And the reason that we did that is because we can't go out in the field and actually challenge them, with a field strain of Brucella. We can't throw a fetus out there. We'd probably get fired, thrown in jail or something. So what we wanted to do is look at the results of that and break this down to either have a viable birth or they have a reproductive failure, one way or another. And reproductive failure is either stillbirth or abortion. Just reproductive failures, just kind of a catch-all term. So for our test, we broke this down into 4 main tests for serology. Pre versus post vaccination, very straightforward. What would you expect from, I'm asking the audience, what would you expect with this test? Anybody? Somebody raise your hand, please answer. You would expect it to decline, yes, after you vaccinate. So continuing on, we also wanted to look at the effect of vaccination on seroprevalence and see if there was a decline. So as you increase vaccination, is there a subsequent decrease in seroprevalence? And we also wanted to look at this over time. So we controlled for age and year, or age and feet grown with our tests, and we did this cumulatively. So comparing the serology within the same year, and then looking at the cumulative 3, 5, and 8-year averages of vaccination coverage. So you would expect that as you increase as time goes on, it should have an effect. You should see a pretty good association, even a stronger association over time. And that was with juvenile vaccination. If that wasn't enough, we also wanted to add the addition of yearlings and adults. So to see if not boostering, but just vaccinating yearlings and adults also would have even a stronger association vaccinating these juveniles. And then lastly, feeding end date has been shown to be pretty predictive of the decline in seroprevalence. So as you shorten the feeding season, we tend to see a decrease in prevalence, at least in feed prevalence. So we wanted to compare this to the effect of vaccination. So we used 2 really long-term data sets, one from the National Elk Refuge and then one from Grace River, where we started the program, and basically compare end date versus vaccination, see which one had a greater association. And then with reproductive outcome, pretty basic tests, unvaccinated versus vaccinated, and then trying to mimic more of a controlled study. You have a control group where you don't vaccinate, delta-free feed ground where you never vaccinated. We actually couldn't condition elk to be vaccinated. And so it just defaulted into a control curve. And then versus all our feed grounds where we had 100% average coverage, and that was eight feed grounds. So. And then also we wanted to look at the reproductive outcome, basically to see if there was a decline in reproductive failures as vaccination coverage increased. So, results. For serology, pretty simple. Basically, among all of these tests, none of them showed reduced prevalence. Out of something like 11 or 12 different models, we did not see decline. And just for folks who like to see a little bit of data, yeah, basically pre versus post, no difference. And end date was actually a much greater, again, it's a much greater predictor than vaccination. So much more strongly associated with decline in prevalence. For the vaginal implants, we did find that if you had 100% coverage vaccination, you did see fewer reproductive failures. There was a significant association. Otherwise, we really didn't see an effect or an association. So this figure here, basically, you got a percentage of juveniles vaccinated, and down here you can't quite see it, it's just off the screen. And 1 is birth, 0 is failure. So we do see, it's a really, really, really slight decrease, but unfortunately it wasn't significant. So, in trying to get over the metaphorical hurdle of brucellosis, why did strain 19 not work? Why did it fail? So Brucella is an intercellular parasite. It's kind of sneaky. It's hard to attack and generally takes a live vaccine. This vaccine didn't really produce, in a lot of these subsequent trials, didn't produce a positive immune response. And then the folks that tried booster doses, same deal. No positive effect on the immune response. So we still have a lot of abortions, even though we were vaccinated, we still have a lot of abortions going on. As Jared mentioned with his talk, there's still quite a few, and with the time that the elk are spending on feed grounds, you've got contacts, elk are still contacting, basically the disease persists. So for us, I guess, the next step essentially is trying to find an oral vaccine. That's kind of what we're looking at right now. There's some researchers doing that. But other options, we've got custodial scavenging. So scavengers are basically not harvested or harassed on feed grounds, so we allow them to clean up what's out there. And then a couple other options, spatiotemporal type options, which Ben's going to get into in his talk. Early end date, low density feeding. These are both options that we feel are going to be fairly positive and have an effect. So big thanks to everybody that collaborated over the years, especially the feed ground supervisors, vaccinators. Huge effort to do a program like this.